Hi folks, I'm orta therox, a developer designer working on the TypeScript team at Microsoft. If you like these videos, you can sponsor my work on GitHub sponsors. I'm a pretty active reader of Twitter and occasionally write. And I saw another interesting event this week on the sort of developer Twitter, which I couldn't really get out of my head. My last video on sort of developer Twitter was about whether people should be dogpiling on bad Twitter takes, especially ones that come from people that are new to Twitter and just sort of exploring the medium. I generally argued that sort of quote tweeting some bad hot take is generally just a bit of weird virtue signaling and sort of it makes you feel a little bit better in the in the moment, but at the expense of basically sort of letting that view get more viewers in exchange for you feeling good about yourself. And this week, though, there was a really interesting case study that sort of came up of someone choosing to self-immolate on Twitter via their blog. And this is the story of who cancelled Jack Mcdade. So back in May, I was introduced to Jack Mcdade through his website. I started following him because he'd been doing some really interesting design work. I unfollowed after about a month, generally because I don't try and follow accounts that are like a bit too self-marketing-y and always a bit too chipper. For me, as a reasonably cynical Brit, I feel like we all give a facade out, but sometimes the sort of American level of it can sometimes be a bit much for me. But on Tuesday of this week, in a sort of like announcement to the world post, Jack announced that he was voting conservative. And given that the US is a sort of two-party system and it's about 50-50 from the looks of things, that it's split like Republican and Democrat, then this shouldn't necessarily necessitate a sort of reveal post. And honestly, when I thought about it, I couldn't actually think of any other sort of existing tweets or posts that I'd seen where someone had really felt the need to reveal themselves like this. So it was a bit of a first time interesting like take to even see somebody start announcing that. And so before we sort of try and understand like the sort of the outcomes of his post, I want to sort of contextualize Jack a little bit. He has shipped about as many tweets as I have, so somewhere in the range of like 40,000 over the last decade or so. And generally makes a living off his sort of Twitter brand and definitely knows and understands the meta of like Twitter, creating content for the internet and sort of understanding how to ship something to a lot of people and sort of the ramifications that come from some of those trade-offs. So to sort of give you an idea of what his post is, his sort of post describes how he's previously had to hide a lot of his beliefs and that he expects to be cancelled for writing this post about being a conservative. And he's going to tell us in this post what he believes and that he believes conceptually that prosperity comes from hard work and self-discipline and that small businesses are the sort of backbone of the economy. This is like a very normal, conservative perspective. And he argues that the church has lost its way and that he needs he needs to vote for a party that sort of aligns with his religious views and beliefs. He believes that the sort of Democratic Party seek to sort of divide kids from their parents and wants to fight for the rights and the Democratic Party wants to fight for the rights to kill unborn children. He believes that Democrats want to maintain an unconstitutional separation of church and state and wants to fill these the positions of power with non-Christians. He knows that people might cancel him for this beliefs, but he says it all with love and wishes that everybody would see the world through his perspective and his God's perspective. And now to be explicit about what I'm trying to do here, this isn't a takedown video of his explicit, the writing that he has here. I'm not very interested in trying to dissect his post and, point out ideas that might be fallacies, but the interesting thing for me is trying to figure out why was it this post that went viral and how did it caused such a gut reaction in so many people, because the sort of the level of response that he got for this is probably like unexpected, even for someone that starts and finishes the post saying that he's going to be cancelled. Like last time I looked, there was still someone tweeting at him almost every 10 minutes. So I sort of tried to distill the two main reasons that sort of make this post like so flamey and like so easy for people to sort of retort to in a way that like, you know, encourages the responses that it ended up getting. So I think it comes down to two major reasons, and the first of those is ignorance, and the second is religion. So for ignorance, a lot of this post is just plain wrong. And like, you know, in some contexts, it is totally fine to be wrong on the internet. And, you know, lots of people do this and they don't get obscene amounts of backlash. But what kind of raises this profile for this post is generally like a few sort of choice quotes that are like either unfinished or, you know, would... reading his addendums like were badly written in a way that like could cause people to sort of easily react. So like, for example, he has a quote where like every life matters, you know, which is a phrase that kind of evokes the dog whistle of all lives matter. And like, you know, given the sort of daily protests about Black Lives Matter and the police brutality, like it's just pretty tone deaf writing. And I think the thing that people really started to dig into was the phrase that, like, you know, the Democrats aim to create a divide between kids and their parents. And, like, in the context of, like, you know, Trump and the Republicans explicitly having goals to separate parents from their children in sort of detention camps, like, that's really, like, he is saying here that, like, you know, the teachings of people that go off to like higher education, they end up like separating the parents who have, you know, I assume strong Republican beliefs, and the children that end up going off to education and end up, you know, having Democratic beliefs. Like that's the separation he's trying to talk about, but like it's just so badly worded in this case that it just becomes such large fuel for that single concept. And like he argues for the rights of like unborn children, which is just weasel words for saying like that, you know, abortion rights are more important than the rights of people who, you know, need an abortion. And, you know, that alone is a trap for anybody that wants to sort of put their foot in. And like calling for the separation of church and state as being unconstitutional is just plain wrong. Like I'm not even American, and I know that church and state separation is a conceptual thing that the founding fathers were like very serious about. And like, you know, writing in a post with a large amount of like factual inaccuracies isn't necessarily going to cause it to go viral. But, you know, he released it on election day, a period where for a lot of people, the amount of like, you know, pressure on them at that point, you know, struggling to come to grips with what a lot of people consider to be like life or death decisions, like coming out of the door being incorrect on a lot of things is just like setting a target on your back. And the other part is the way in which he sort of phrased a lot of these like these ideas. So all of his arguments are sort of backed up by his religious beliefs. And like, I'm an atheist, but my mum, you know, she started a food bank in a church, set up homeless shelters, you know, she built pay what you want cafes in multiple towns, and is now an ordained reverend. Like, I went walking around town with her last time I was in the country, and like she knew the name of almost every homeless person we walked by, and they waved. Like she truly knew, in my opinion, what it looks like to be a like Christian. And like, I think generally speaking, the developer sphere defaults to assuming that everyone is atheistic, but like being outwardly, you know, religious in developer circles isn't necessarily asking for trouble or for like, you know, a viral like post in any way. You know, that I work with folks that have like their religious beliefs on their Twitter bios. It's not uncommon to see like high profile JavaScript people, you know, that are in the Latter-day Saints or something like that. And, you know, there are people doing foundational work in open source that have really cool podcasts like Henry Zhu, who has, the Hope in Source podcast on the idea of how open source and faith can like mix and how that you can learn from both sides. Like, there are people in every community that take their sort of spiritual identity and like include it in the sort of online persona that they are. And like those people bring really interesting new perspectives into like the open source community. And so like using his religion as a sort of focal point for tricky arguments, especially when these are not particularly backed up with any sources, like there's zero links in this sort of post. So like you can't like how is anybody meant to argue with any of these points? In part because like religion allows for people to have unquestionable beliefs in ways that like don't need to be like logically backed up, and like it's totally okay that people can have these beliefs, but like when you're making something that you know to be vitriolic on the internet, like he mentions multiple times that he expects this to cancel him, like trying to hedge bad bets around the idea of like your religion actually really makes it hard for people to find much empathy in trying to understand the reasoning for how you came to some of these conclusions. And so like, unlike the previous tweets that we looked at before, like, Jack has been playing the internet for like a decade or so and knew the meta game that he was playing in actually in writing this post and publishing in it and editing and updating it. Like, I don't think you can treat these two sorts of sort of occurrences within the developer Twitter sphere as being the same. Like, there is the idea of somebody like learning and struggling how to sort of, find their Twitter identity and, making dumb calls. And then there is somebody that is consciously putting out inflammatory material out onto the net, knowing fully well what they are doing and the potential consequences for them. Like, this makes it super disappointing when someone who people looked up to, as being on the ball, doing cool, interesting things, as being like part of it, like the community, like publicly states their ignorance and like wraps it up in a religious bow. Like, it makes me feel like, who canceled Jack Mcdade? Well, he did, knowingly. And so, I mean, what can we learn from this, right? Like, it's great to describe and try and understand like what caused people to, feel like what caused people to react in such a way. But like, how can we try and think about this so that like either it doesn't happen to yourself or that we like gain more empathy from like that event? And like, the day job of most developers is figuring out, logical errors in the bugs that we ship every single day and trying to figure out build systems that we always have impartial knowledge of. And every single group, like, especially one of the size that like, the developer ecosystem is like massive and has cultural norms. And generally speaking, in technology, people just make the assumption that you are left-leaning, logical, empathetic, and well-informed. And if you're going to be writing something that like is going to go against those like grains, then that's totally like something you can do. But you really need to take the time to be more nuanced, to back up your ideas with sources, to really like put the time into the sort of craft of the post, maybe the tweet. Like, a tweet's going to be like so short that you don't necessarily need that much time on it, but trying to think about how your writing will affect people and the sort of outcomes of those is super important. And making sure that you link to sources, making sure that you try and have a very coherent like story about how you came to like a particular conclusion is just good writing. And like, Jack managed to do very little of that. And in exchange, he did a quick backup update where he said he wasn't going to delete anything. He tried to like argue some of his points a little bit further, but again, never really improved on the original points, and instead just turned off his, just logged off Twitter. And putting your head in the sand is definitely a solution. And eventually, maybe in a few days, like the tweets to him will have calmed down. But during that time, I really hope that he takes the time to see that like the dogpiling on in this case, it's not quite deserved, but it should have been expected. And like, you can have perspectives. Like, you can vote Republican. You can argue for your own perspective. But if you're going to do it in a way that is very obviously uninformed and such easy flame bait material, I think you have to really take the time to plan it, spend some time asking other people for perspective and trying to see whether like you can ship it in a way that like either persuades people or at least makes them feel like you're not just using religion to sort of hide the underlying like reason that you're voting for them. I don't know. So in summary, if you're going to write something that could be tricky for people to read and to respond, you should first consider, should you? Then you should second consider, how much time does it need for me to take in order for me to ship this in a way that is not going to like cause so much problems for me in the future?